The wrestling internet is up in arms again, this time over comments Kevin Nash said on his podcast about current WWE fan favorite LA Knight. Big Daddy Cool Diesel referred to LA Knight as an absolute ripoff of The Rock, and on today's Wrestle Juice, we're going to talk about it. Yeah! Hey friendos, welcome back to Wrestle Juice. So, what did Kevin Nash say exactly about LA Knight on his podcast? These were his words. Am I the only one that sees an absolute ripoff of The Rock to the point where he cut the promo on fucking Logan Paul or whatever the fuck his name is? He said, yeah, stick it. The only thing he didn't do was turn the motherfucker sideways. Jesus Christ. What, does everybody have amnesia? There's nothing original. His promos. Finally, LA Knight has come back as a white guy. First up, I want to take one line out of Kevin Nash's podcast spiel here and emphasize that. He says there's nothing original. That's totally true. There really is nothing original anymore. In fact, pro wrestling is one of those forms of entertainment, much like movies, television, and music, that shamelessly takes both from pro wrestling's past and other forms of entertainment outside of pro wrestling. For example, Kevin Nash's best friend, Scott Hall, may he rest in peace, directly ripped off Al Pacino's Scarface when coming up with his Razor Ramon character. He was completely open about that. I am completely shocked that Crow creator James O'Barr never sued WCW for the Sting's reinvention as Crow Sting. Literally, he just completely ripped off sort of the Crow aesthetic, and he's still doing it today, jumping off ladders. But of course, there's been multiple times in wrestling where wrestlers will rip off other wrestlers. Of course, Hulk Hogan famously ripped off like everything superstar Billy Graham did except for the tie-dye. Ric Flair stole the Nature Boy thing from Buddy Rogers, who for all I know might have stolen that from somebody else. Wrestling steals from wrestling. Wrestling steals from things outside of wrestling. But that's just sort of entertainment in general. If you ever watch the movie Alphaville, a Jean-Luc Godard movie from like the early 60s, you can see Darth Vader, The Matrix, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and Blade Runner all directly lifted from that one single movie. So the bottom line is, yes, Kevin Nash is right. Nothing is original anymore, and it really hasn't been for a very, very long time. A quick side note here before we get into the actual comparison of The Rock and LA Knight. I saw a Twitter take on here that says AEW has their own Rock knockoff, and of course they're talking about Ricky Starks, which is odd because Ricky just kind of has some vague similarities physically to The Rock, but really doesn't take anything else. So leave Ricky out of this. Let's talk about some of the similarities there are between The Rock and LA Knight. The first one, and it's the most obvious one, of course, is LA Knight's promos. This is what Kevin Nash is talking about here, the cadence. The way he talks, what he says, how he says it. LA Knight just very recently in an interview with Ariel Helwani during the Money in the Bank press junket stuff talked about his comparisons that have been made rather between LA Knight, The Rock, and to a degree Stone Cold Steve Austin. Because yes, I totally see, and everybody else does see, that there are definite similarities between his cadence and the way he delivers his promos and The Rock's. I also do get a little hint of Stone Cold Steve Austin, and LA Knight was very forthcoming about that. And he said, basically, I grew up with those guys. I grew up watching them on VHS. That was my, in his words, bread and butter back then. So yeah, some of my cadence is like those guys, but he takes it and he does his own thing with it. Now, I guess that part of it could be debatable. I kind of feel like the guy does run with it in his own way. And I do actually think that the characters themselves are pretty different. If you think about it, The Rock's character's origins came from the massive chip on his shoulder he had from being humiliated by the WWF fans upon his debut. Failing as a pure babyface brewed resentment in The Rock, so much so that he used that as motivation to climb the ranks, manipulating anyone and everyone around him for his own benefit. Once this brash Rock became so popular as a bad guy, the WWF had no choice but to turn him face. And at Survivor Series 98, he turned on the crowd again to align with Mr. McMahon, blaming their treatment of his early run for his turn. The Rock's arrogance was born out of a resentment for the fans, an irony given he dubbed himself the People's Champion. He both craved and resented their acceptance. LA Knight is not that. LA Knight is a character who seemingly just sort of appeared out of thin air one time on NXT, had the most ridiculous, unbelievable name you'd ever hear, and carried himself like a guy who's absolutely bulletproof. LA Knight is essentially Teflon. He doesn't care what you say about him. He just moves on to the next thing and burns the other guy down. This happened the other night on SmackDown right before Money in the Bank when Logan Paul said, they were going to make you a manager here in WWE. and it was a relatively effective line, but like LA Knight just didn't care. He just moved on and it didn't affect him. It didn't make him look worse or anything. LA Knight so far has not proven to be a guy that kind of sells anybody. And the biggest proof of that is he had a feud with Bray Wyatt in which he came out stronger looking than Bray Wyatt, even though he lost that ridiculous Mountain Dew match. I mean, I'll never forget, he got the 2-for-1 special on Bray Wyatt, slapping him twice in the same segment and walked away laughing. And then every time Bray Wyatt would attack him, LA Knight just wouldn't give a shit. He would just look for him and want to beat him up again. He's just relentless. And those are two very distinct different characters, LA Knight and The Rock. The thing about LA Knight is that I appreciate really is that the guy is, for a wrestler anyways, a little bit advanced in age. He's not like in his early 20s. I think the guy is in his late 30s or maybe he's reached 40. I don't know exactly. I could probably look it up, but I'm not going to. Whether it's as LA Knight or Eli Drake before that in Impact Wrestling and NWA, he has always managed to get himself over in a major way with the crowd, whether it was any of the gimmicks he came up with, like the dummy yeah button or just the catchphrase yeah or the Kavorka thing. The crowd always finds something in him that they really love. Nobody since The Rock has really walked in with that kind of confidence and swagger the way LA Knight has. And I think it's that people are gravitating to. Do they sort of have that nostalgia thing where it's like, oh, this guy kind of reminds me of The Rock? Yeah, sure. He does sound like him. There are similarities. There are definite similarities there, but I would stop short of calling him a knockoff. Don't get me wrong. I love Kevin Nash. He's one of my favorite guys, and he always has been, and I love his podcast. I think he's terrific, and the dude is obviously entitled to his opinion, and let's be frank, that dude is a legend, and his opinion means a hell of a lot more than mine. I just happen to disagree with him in this case. I don't think LA Knight is a ripoff. I think he's more of an homage who's taken that homage and sort of made it his own thing. And I think the crowd absolutely loves him. And I really hope the WWE runs with him in terms of giving him more success. Maybe he can go after the US title, something like that. In the end, there's one thing that matters. Does the crowd give a crap about LA Knight? And if you watch WWE right now, LA Knight is getting crowd reactions larger and more enthusiastic than literally anyone on the roster. And he's done it with no sustained push, with no big winning streak, without even having a solid run of feuds or regular time on TV. He didn't get the Seth or Cody or Sammy treatment, and yet his crowd pops rival all three of those guys. And maybe it's because the crowd hasn't seen anything like him since The Rock, and they're all craving something close to it. Whatever the reason is, it's working. So that's the bottom line on LA Knight as far as I see it. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Check out this video over here. Hey, if you haven't already, do me a huge favor. Hit that thumbs up button. Hit that subscribe button. I'd really appreciate it. Till next time, we'll see you around.